So what is this molten metal? It's a direct evidence for the use of thermite.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers.
I found a pore in the steel that had pure sulfur embedded in the pore, which I thought was very strange, and so that's when I really started looking for sulfur and finding it in more abundance in some of these phases.
There's a government theory that calcium sulfate from gypsum boards was the source of sulfur, and that's wrong. Calcium sulfate cannot undergo any kind of a chemical reaction that produces the element sulfur, and we're not dealing with any kind of compound of sulfur. When we're talking about sulfidation, we're dealing with the element sulfur.
There's a version of thermite called Thermite, which has sulfur in the thermate, and what the sulfur does is it's sort of like salt on ice.
And it just basically makes the steel melt at a lower temperature. And if you do a search on Google for thermite and building demolition, you can find devices that have been fabricated and invented that use thermite for building demolitions.
In the case of thermite cutting charges, you would have heard far less noise, since they are worked by thermal heating, melting of the steel, rather than an explosive cutting as in RDX charges.
Overflights had detected with infrared camera 1400 degree Fahrenheit hotspots on the surface of ground zero, and that being there for a week indicates that there was something very hot going on below the surface.
So thermite would also explain potentially the fact that the fires could not be put out at ground zero. The fires lasted for quite a while, but most importantly, they were deep within the pile, where people would expect that the environment was oxygen starved. And thermite could explain this because it has its own oxidant within. It's actually the metallic oxide that provides the oxidant to allow the incendiary thermite reaction to occur, even underwater.
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres. What does this tell us about the temperatures generated in the tower's destruction?
When the USGS collected samples of the World Trade Center dust, they found the iron microspheres. Insofar, the USGS does not have a valid explanation for the presence of these iron microspheres.
So what do the microspheres contain? Iron is the main element, and then it has smaller portions of aluminum, sulfur, a trace of manganese. Most of them are less than about 1/10 of an inch in diameter, and they're spherical. And they're found in all of the dust blown out of the buildings during collapse, no matter where in Manhattan that dust is picked up.
You must have had a much hotter heat source for you to get 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt the iron to get these molten spheres. Your heat source must be something like a chemical reaction, an exothermic chemical reaction that reacts, in the case of thermite, reacts at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit.
My contention, based on finding thermite residue in the dust, is that it happened before. It didn't happen after in the fires that ensued in the rubble pile afterwards. It's all the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
Out of the ashes of the World Trade Center devastation rises the Freedom Tower, whose foundation, however, is shrouded in question. For example, in the World Trade Center dust, an international team of scientists find an advanced form of highly energetic nanothermite composites. What is it, and where does it come from?
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips. And in the reaction, they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction. And such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures. What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite, which is produced in a different way. It is not just two powders being mixed. The material is actually built from the atom scale up. We call it the bottom-up procedure, which is what you do in nanotechnology. The ingredients are much smaller, which means they're reacting faster and they are more easily ignited.
The primary elements in the red material are aluminum, iron oxide, as well as silicon and carbon. The iron oxide appears in faceted grains, approximately 100 nanometers across. The aluminum appears in thin platelets, about 40 nanometers thick. In ordinary thermite, the particle size is much larger, and hence ordinary thermite is an incendiary, whereas as the particle size becomes smaller and smaller, super thermite is sometimes called. This red material contains also a significant amount of carbon, and the formulation of nanothermite as described by National Laboratory publications also implies the presence of carbon, very typically. The organic is used with nanothermite in order to produce gas, and that is a very high pressure gas. We do have descriptions from the Livermore National Laboratory in particular of how they fabricated this material, but to fabricate it is not so easy. This is discussed in our paper in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, published in April of 2009. So far, none of these papers have been refuted in the literature, the scientific literature. So that means they are unchallenged in the scientific sense. They stand as an indictment, really, of the official story of 9/11.
One of the things I'd like to stress about these chips is they're not a natural formed agglomeration of aluminum from the aircraft or materials that were in the building and iron oxide that got knocked off. It isn't just a haphazard bringing together of iron oxide and aluminum, which is the basic components of thermite. This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical.
There was actually some significant findings in the residue. After igniting these chips in the DSC, we found microspheres. The significance of the calorimeter cannot be understated here. Many of these spheres had the exact or identical composition or very similar composition as the spheres that Steve was finding in the dust samples. They were also very similar to spheres found in thermite, in commercial thermite. There were no microspheres found in the paint sample that had been ignited in the DSC. We also took paint that came off of the WTC steel and looked at that in the SEM and did a compositional analysis of that and found that it was not similar to the red-gray chip or the red layer of the red-gray chips.
This cannot be paint. Paint does not have these exotic properties. It's impossible.
This is material that is of military use that really shouldn't be there.